Welcome to Econ 102, where economist Noah Smith and I make sense of what's happening in the news, technology, business, and beyond through the lens of economics. Let's jump right in.
Today on Econ 102, we want to shout out another podcast from Noah and economist Brad DeLong that you may want to add to your rotation. Noah and Brad engage in spirited debates to teach people good economics, evaluate policy implementation, and discuss geopolitics. In this episode ahead, they discuss the potential for a China Shock 2.0 and the changing role of economists since the 2008 financial crisis. Please enjoy.
Noah, what is the key insight?
Hexapedia is the key insight, 6 feet.
And what is that supposed to mean?
That there is often some key nugget of fact that if you grasp it and understand it will allow you to grok the situation completely.
And in the context of Werner Vinge's mind-bending science fiction novel, A Fire Upon the Deep?
The importance of Hexapedia is
that those sapient bushes riding around on 6-wheeled scooters
have been genetically programmed to be spies and agents for the great evil.
But today we seek different key insights than Hexapedia.
And what are we seeking today?
We are seeking to see if Noah will ever admit that he was wrong.
Well, I often do, but we will see if I admit that I was wrong about these particular things.
All right, so today I have 4 things that I want you to hit you with and to defend. That you say now we're about to undergo China Shock 2, and I say that China Shock 1, really required the George W. Bush administration as unwitting co-conspirator to produce bad results for the United States. And that at least as long as we avoid re-electing Donald Trump to the presidency in November, we're unlikely to have governments that handle it as badly as the George W. Bush administration did. Of course, that's a very big asterisk. The second is you say that you see economics and
hold on. Why don't we just deal with the first? Because if we list all of them, then people won't be able to remember.
All right.
By the time we get to them.
All right.
How about we just go one by one?
Okay. So China Shock 2. Back in the early 2000s, or throughout the 2000s, the United States had this enormous surge of manufactured imports from China that devastated U.S. manufacturing production primarily in the Midwest and the upper Midwest of the United States. Now, for employment as a whole, in fact, even for employment of male workers in traditional blue-collar industries, up until 2007, the 2000s were more or less a so-so decade. But the traditional male blue-collar jobs created were overwhelmingly construction jobs in the Sun Belt, while the manufacturing jobs that were destroyed were kind of manufacturing jobs in the Midwest. And so the huge gainers were people who moved to the Sun Belt, especially people who spoke Spanish and could communicate with recent immigrants, and also recent immigrants from Spanish-speaking countries who could benefit from the high wages offered in construction. The people who lost big time were relatively older manufacturing workers, most of them Anglo, in the Midwest, who had put down roots and could no longer move to opportunity. And so this division between the blue-collar male working class turned out to have enormous cultural impacts on people's view about how American politics should work and set the stage for the rise of Donald Trump. I say this China Shock 1 only happened the way it did, because the George W. Bush administration badly fumbled the macroeconomic response to the problems of the 2000s.
Well, so I would say that, in my view, yes, United States policy could have done a lot better, with regards to the first China shock. But a couple things. Number one, it was very long in coming. I don't actually see the George Bush administration as being particularly decisive there. I think that the George W. Bush's administration's macroeconomic policies before the Great Recession, before the financial crisis.
Right.
So in terms of allowing a housing bubble to fester, allowing deregulated finance to go crazy, all these things Those things were all bad. And so I will not say the George W. Bush administration was a good steward of the macroeconomy because they were terrible.
Right.
But as regards the China shock, in the 2000s before the crisis, interest rates were low, very low. And
in order to boost housing construction.
Well, I mean, that's the effect that it had, but I don't think that the Fed specifically was targeting that industry.
Well, that's the only industry the Fed can ever target, right?
It has become increasingly important. It became increasingly important until the Great Recession, and then after the Great Recession, it became a bit less important as the response to monetary policy. But Ed Leamer's paper, Housing is the Business Cycle,
yes.
that pattern, as soon as he observed it, was already broken.
Well, the business cycle is more complicated, but
in the aftermath of the Great Recession, monetary policy had effect through other industries, not housing.
So monetary policy has effects on export and import competing industries through the exchange rate, yes. And
well, that's
monetary
true too.
policy has effects on construction. But the entire rest of the economy runs on cash flow and animal spirits. And even though it ought to run on Tobin's Q, as a rule, it almost never does.
Fair enough.
And to the extent it does operate on Tobin's Q, monetary policy has only a very small impact on what Tobin's Q is. Look at this year, when expectations of long-term interest rates have been rising substantially, and yet the stock market has been growing even faster as expected future profits outrun higher expected future interest rates.
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay. When you blame a macroeconomic debacle on a particular country's political leadership, you need to look at other countries and see if it happened. The first thing you need to do, look at other countries and see if something similar happened there. And what we see with the China shock is that countries had a very uneven response to it. We see that Japan also had a loss of manufacturing workers.
Right.
We see that Britain and some other countries had a loss of manufacturing workers. And we see that two countries in particular had a gain in manufacturing industries,
yes.
even though, they had a gain, which were Germany and South Korea. Those were the countries, and Taiwan, but Taiwan primarily just owned Chinese factories, so that's a little different. But Korea and Germany started manufacturing a whole bunch of intermediate goods, everything from steel to machine tools to transportation equipment, and selling it to China as fast as they could.
Yes.
Japan tried to do this, but China blocked them from doing this by not buying Japanese because of World War II.
Because of World War II.
But so that hurt Japan, and at this point, Taiwan wasn't. They were a little bit in that game, but they aren't really capital equipment.
And the United States should have been doing the same thing.
We should have been doing the same thing. It wasn't George W. Sorry.
As China ramped up its manufacturing and as its economy grew at 10% per year. And we would have been doing the same thing, except for the fact that we needed financing for the housing bubble from China, and for the fact that we needed financing from China in order to support the blowing open wide of the budget deficit of the George W. Bush years. And those two things, the housing bubble on the one hand, pushed by shaky deregulated finance, and the blowing open of the budget deficit, the disappearance of the Clinton-Gore surpluses, et cetera, those were the things that required us to run a very large trade deficit in the mid-2000s, which was the thing that meant that American manufacturing workers couldn't do what Korean and German manufacturing workers did, which was shift from making goods for making low-end final goods for domestic consumption to making higher-end intermediate goods for Chinese purchase.
All right. So here's what I have to say. First of all, higher interest rates would not have resulted in a capital goods export boom to China. There is no model there's no reasonable model, no model I can think of in which that would have happened.
Well,
higher U.S. interest rates.
Yeah.
Higher interest rates could have worked. Well, hold on. Higher interest rates could have worked by appreciating the U.S. currency, which have made our exports less competitive than they were even. Higher interest rates could have had some complicated political economic effect where they forced fiscal austerity, although that wouldn't have actually happened, but it theoretically could have. And then you could say that the political economic effect of fiscal austerity would be to, decrease the trade deficit. But I think that the effect of higher interest rate, the primary effect of higher interest rates would have canceled that out. I don't see fiscal austerity as I don't think that would have resulted in a capital export boom to China for the simple fact that it did not in the 1990s. It didn't happen because simply balancing your budget does not. There's no real plausible path to within 5 years to a capital export goods boom. And I don't think that Germany's tendency toward austerity, because South Korea ran large budget deficits during this time, Germany ran moderate budget deficits, and I do not think that macroeconomic austerity, particularly helped them in their export boom. I think it was the industrial structure they had built up over a very long period of time through, in both industrial policy and comparative advantage, and their special relationships with China that made China feel like these are people we can buy from safely. I think that those things, I think China would have been willing to buy capital goods from us, but we didn't make any machine tools by this point, and we didn't make a lot of steel by this point, and we didn't, we made some transportation equipment, so we sold them some John Deere tractors, but it was just a drop in the bucket. And so, those were not things that the United States made at that time of the China shock, and this was due to a longer failure of industrial policy that long predated the Bush administration. If that were your argument, I would say I don't disagree. You're absolutely right. But I think that essentially by the time the China shock rolled around, the only thing America could have done to prevent it would be some sort of trade policy, because trade policy has rapid effects where, industrial policy takes decades.
Supply and demand in the foreign exchange market have rapid effects as well. They move the exchange rate and change import and export flows. It wasn't so much the low interest rates of the 2000s that produced the housing bubble as it was the extremely dodgy mortgage financing. If there had been a Democratic president in office, Ned Gramlich would have been much, much stronger in his attempts within the Fed to get Alan Greenspan to take dodgy mortgage finance much, much more seriously. And without the dodgy mortgage finance, we would have had, say, a significantly smaller housing bubble, which would have required significantly less housing or significantly less capital imports or capital finance imports from China. We're using capital imports and exports here in two different ways. Capital finance imports from China. And the continuation of Clinton-Gore fiscal policies would have also allowed for a considerably lower increase or lower amount of capital finance imports from China as well, which would have left an awful lot of space for the United States to export something to China. Or if the United States didn't export something to China, the exchange rate would have adjusted and the China shock would have been significantly less.
I disagree for two reasons. Number one, at that point, our exchange rate with China was being controlled by a central bank, and that central bank was not ours.
Well,
China's central bank, the People's Bank of China,
two central banks, one of which was ours.
It was being controlled by one central bank, and that central bank was not ours. The Fed did not have control, because what the Fed could have done was raise the cost for China's central bank to hold its peg against the dollar.
Right.
But China would have paid that cost. And so China's buying of dollars was not particularly premised on the price of the assets they were getting, the value. And even had those assets had no value, China would have still bought them. So even if China had known that those assets, that those agency bonds and treasury bonds that they were buying to hold their currency at what it was, I believe they still would have bought them.
So you are saying that China would have hit its export targets to the United States no matter what, that they would have let the exchange rate go wherever it was in order to produce the right amount of renminbi.
That is what I believe in the 2000s. Yes, I don't believe that would have been true later on. Pardon?
Sorry. And to the extent that there was a lot less in the terms of capital imports from China, or capital financing imports from China to finance the federal deficit and the housing bubble. Well, all that would have meant that without that financing, that China would have sold its manufactured goods to us for considerably less than it did.
Right. And I think
that looks like a significant win for the United States that the Bush administration threw away by requiring a higher renminbi exchange rate or a higher value of the renminbi in order to get financing, not just for U.S. purchases of Chinese-made consumer goods, but also for financing of the housing bubble and the federal deficit. And that at least China Shock 1 would have been part of a process much more advantageous to the United States had the Bush administration not been there.
Well, okay. So there's a number of things to unpack there. One is that, Ben Bernanke was advocating the savings glut theory at the time, which is, I think what we're talking about is similar to that.
Yes.
And the question is, had the United States cracked down on the housing market, would we have
cracked down on that? Well, simply let the housing market function normally, with people having to put 20% down before they thought, do I really want this house in the desert between San Bernardino and Albuquerque?
Indeed, which I believe we should have done.
Yes.
Which I believe we should have done, but I do not.
Which Ned Gramlich very much wanted to do.
Right. The mechanism by which this would have resulted in a more balanced trade with China eludes me.
You mean simply that we're importing less capital from China, which means what then does the financial capital coming in from China to...
But why would we have been importing less capital from China? Because if, buying treasury bonds and buying agency bonds, they're not that different. China could have bought treasuries instead of agencies, and that would have gotten China entirely out of the...
And as I say, the magnitudes are large, and so the exchange rate would have had to been significantly different.
I do not think that less, bubble activity in the housing market would have resulted in fewer Chinese capital exports to the United States.
More federal deficits in the 1980s certainly produced a huge amount of additional financial capital imports to the United States from Europe and Japan.
Yes, but Europe and Japan, first of all, Japan were market economies with floating exchange rates.
The twin deficits theory is a pretty good theory. It works most of the time, except when fiscal austerity is accompanied by the enormous internet.com boom.
I think that the twin deficits theory is one of many things going on and takes many years to
but it's
happen.
Often a very big thing going on.
I don't know that I buy that. I think that for example, with Japan, you had decades of incredibly massive deficits, 2 decades of incredibly massive deficits, maybe a decade and a half, which were not matched, which Japan's trade surplus just persisted for that whole time.
Yes.
And so therefore, that's not saying that the twin deficits theory has no
part of a world system by which things go up and down, with a United States structural deficit, which cyclically gets much larger and much smaller depending upon the current macroeconomic configuration.
I believe that the Chinese capital inflows that, were because China wanted to peg its exchange rate. In order to do that in a sterilized way, they needed the PBOC to hold reserves. America is the reserve currency. Done.
And with the enormous growth of worldwide reserves, the United States is going to have a structural balance of payments deficit simply because we have to create the safe assets for other people to hold. Whether the other people are foreign central banks engaged in industrial policy, foreign central banks who don't want to be under the thumb of the IMF ever, or foreign rich people who want, in case the balloon goes up and they have to flee in the Learjet or the rubber boat, to hit the United States with a large bank account, at JP Morgan Chase.
The Learjet or the rubber boat is a great name for a book. But anyway, I believe...
What would that... Yes, okay.
What would this be about? It would be about rich people always trying to exit instead of actually, supporting the country they live in.
Yes, okay.
All right, but here's the thing.
Which is sometimes the only good thing to do, right?
Sometimes the only good thing
to do. Think of Martin Wolf's German Jewish grandfather commandeering a boat at gunpoint on May 11th, 1940, and saying, "You are sailing me and my family to England."
Yeah.
As opposed to Anne Frank's father, who in the same city hunkered down and said, "I'm going to hide in the attic."
Yeah. I believe that the China shock was due to a couple policy failures, and I do believe there is something George W. Bush could have done, which is to say that George W. Bush could have labeled China a currency manipulator, which it 100% was at the time.
Yes.
Ironically, it had become much less of a currency manipulator by the time Trump actually got around to listing it as one.
At any event.
But George Bush could have listed as a currency manipulator and could have taken any number of actions to limit Chinese capital inflows, which would have then possibly taken a little of the steam out of the housing bubble. So I think that trying to limit the housing bubble in order to reduce the trade deficit with China would be pushing on a string. Whereas limiting...
could not have done that because the housing bubble and the high income tax cut that created the deficits. The housing bubble was his signature initiative for deregulatory economic freedom and the cutting of red tape. And the high income tax cuts were the entire reason for the modern Republican Party's being.
Okay, but I'm saying you could have done those tax cuts and you also could have taken actions to limit Chinese capital inflows. And then, the problems with the tax cuts still would have existed, but I think that would have probably taken a little bit of the energy out of the housing bubble, although not a lot, honestly, because most of it was
because interest rates are secondary to deregulation and crazy. But in any event, all of this was supposed to be a 5-minute lead-in to you are now scared of China Shock 2.
Oh, I thought we were just talking about China Shock 1 the whole time.
No. The whole point of it was you say there is about to be a China Shock 2. And I say that China Shock 1 required the active cooperation of the G.W. Bush administration as witting and unwitting co-conspirator, and that we are not going to let the same thing happen again. We're pretty good at not making the same mistake twice in a row. We make different mistakes instead.
Well, I completely agree with that.
Hey, everybody. Eric here with a word from our sponsor.
What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. It's a bull market. It's a bear market. Rates will rise or fall. Inflation's up or down. Can someone invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 38,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing the books in days, not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. Whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to your immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning for free at netsuite.com/102. That's netsuite.com/102. netsuite.com/102. Have you heard of this alternative investing company, alts.co? The idea behind it is simple. There are a million syndicates out there that co-invest in startups or real estate. But what about alternative investments? Where do you go if you want to invest in, say, Hollywood film financing deals, or a dozen barrels of tequila, or pro sports teams? There's a world of alternative investments out there, and boy, these guys are all over it. Their community, Altea, is a place for forward-thinking investors to invest in unique, vetted deals, meet captivating people, and enjoy once-in-a-lifetime travel experiences. Apply to join Altea. Who knows where things might lead? Travel, meet unique people, invest in asset classes that are a bit out of your usual lane. This is what Altea gives you. Unique, slightly uncomfortable, but incredibly rewarding experiences which not only help your portfolio, but stretch your mind and allow you to see the world differently. Check these guys out at alts.co/102. That's alts.co/102. alts.co/102.
So why do you think we are facing a China Shock 2?
Oh, I think that we're facing a China Shock 2 if we don't do anything.
Okay.
We're going to do something.
So this is an alarmist self-refute. You are not predicting a China Shock 2. You are rather making an alarmist self-contradictory, or what was it called? The self-denying ordinance of the English Parliament in the 1640s. You are making a self-denying Cassandra-like forecasting something so that it actually does not happen.
Well, that sounds very silly, but then think of this example.
No, it's not silly at all. It's not
Brad,
silly at all. It's
think
the
about
way
this
the world
example,
works.
Brad. Brad.
What?
Think about if I say, look, there's a fire over there. Let's
Yes.
put it out.
Yes.
That is not a forecast.
Well,
That it is a conditional forecast saying if you don't put that fire out now, it will burn down your house. So let's do that because remember the last time your house burned down.
okay. All
And
right.
that seems reasonable to me.
I will go and I will look back at your exact rhetoric in this because I
Yes.
came away with it saying that China Shock 2 was on the way.
Well, China Shock 2
opposed to-
is, an approaching blast wave, and we must get behind,
We must get
behind a wall.
our shields. Yes.
So I will say
that China very much believes that it is going to export hugely additional amounts of manufactured goods to the rest of the world and is starting to do so because they are ideologically opposed to letting private Chinese individuals boost their consumption. And they also are strongly opposed to having construction continue at anything like its current pace at China, or to let the Chinese consume the service sector goods of the consumer internet.
Right.
So
let me tell you this.
Yeah.
So we've already put tariffs on EVs and a number of other things.
Oh,
right.
We have put huge amounts of tariffs on EVs. Yes.
Let's talk about Chinese foundational chips, also called legacy chips.
Mhm.
Today on my blog, I announced a policy contest in cooperation with the Federation of American Scientists, Chris Miller of Chip War, and the blog China Talk,
Okay.
in which we are soliciting ideas for dealing with the threat or even conceptualizing the threat of Chinese legacy chips.
Now, is
And
China
by
Talk
legacy
Bill
chips-
Simmons or is China Talk someone else?
China Talk is Jordan Schneider
Is Jordan Schneider. Okay. So then
and a
what's
bunch of other people.
What's Bill Simmons's China blog called? I can look this up.
I don't remember.
Okay. So Jordan Schneider, Miller of Chip Wars, you, the Federation of American Scientists. The belief that China is going to attempt to dominate the world production of
You meant Bill
not
Bishop.
frontier, but rather legacy chips.
I see.
We need to be able to have legacy chips for our refrigerators and our drones and our so forth.
We do, but by the way, the guy's name is Bill Bishop, and his blog is Cynicism. That's what you're talking about.
Bill Bishop and
I see.
cynicism. Bill Simmons is someone connected with baseball cybermetric.
I think there was a Bill Simmons sports writer. Anyway,
So
okay,
Bill Bishop
point being-
and cynicism. Okay.
all right. So the idea is if you friendshore your output of PCs, cars, smartphones, etc.,
Mhm.
to Mexico, Vietnam, Thailand, etc., India,
Yes.
and if those things contain Chinese-made legacy chips, by legacy I mean things that can't be controlled with export controls.
Well, they could be, but no one wants to control a 30
They can't be.
processed chips with export
They can't be.
controls. They're so
There's
cheap.
no way to. No, there's no way to do it.
I hate to say it, but hate to call any of these things easy to make.
These are easy to make.
My God, that even a 30 nanometer scale chip is an actually awesome technological accomplishment at so many levels, even if it doesn't require the hinky Dutch machines, new Dutch machines.
Right.
Even if these technologies have been around for 2 decades, but they still are awesome technologies.
China is likely already self-sufficient in the ability to make the entire supply chain for chips above, I don't remember, some level of nanometers, but
Say
those
20.
are most of the chips used in the military, cars.
Yes.
Yeah. So China export controls literally cannot stop China from building those things.
Yes.
Cannot. Couldn't, no matter how stringent we ever made them.
But on the other hand, because China can build them, lots and lots of other countries can build them as well. As long as they haven't dismantled their legacy fabs in order to reuse the equipment for more modern fabs.
100%.
Intel used to do, but Intel has stopped doing that. And, I don't think we will have, from one hand, the problem with the legacy chip supply is indeed that they are so cheap because they can be made in so many places.
Right.
And this is a problem not of making the business. This is the problem of making something that is not expensive profitable enough that we have capacity in reserve in case of geopolitical shocks.
Right.
So a legacy, this is calls for a global legacy chip reserve or a United States legacy chip reserve, like we have a strategic petroleum reserve. And like
no, it does not. I mean, that's one idea.
Oddlots Tracy Allen calls for a strategic pork reserve.
I'm not gonna evaluate that idea right now because we want people to be unbiased in the idea competition.
All right.
But okay, here's the thing though. Here's a story in the Register dated 29th of May, 2024. Notorious tech investment firm Elliott Management has penned a letter to Texas Instruments urging the company to change course on its aggressive plan to boost manufacturing capacity. Basically, the fact that China is preparing to flood the entire global market with legacy chips means that there's already pressure on American semiconductor manufacturers to cancel their fabs.
Yes. So basically, he wants investors, he wants people to return capital to them, return their capital to them, and Texas Instruments to curl up and die as an organization.
Of course they want that. So anyway, point being...
This is once again a problem with financial capitalism.
Yes. So unless you plan to implement some sort of non-financial capitalism, we
value our corporations first as, stakeholder networks that are highly productive, and second as forcers and distributors of new technology, and third as places where the widows and orphans, and widowers too, I suppose, in these days, of America can put their money and earn a healthy return, and fourth as the bouncing balls in the roulette wheels of Wall Street casinos, and fifth as potential fodder for meme stock pump and dump schemes. And the problem is that, these particular Elliott investor guys are in business 4 and dearly wish they had Elon Musk's mojo and were in business 5. While the rest of us very much want businesses 1, 2, and 3, stakeholders, technology forcers, and also places where you can earn a return from long-run investment. And this division of interests between the financial capitalists and the rest of us is becoming an increasingly fraught problem in America and in the world today. So we should have a show about financial capitalism.
We should have many shows about financial capitalism.
The whole point is here we have financial capitalism versus the Biden administration, and the Biden administration seems kind of under-equipped for this fight. It's kind of like Godzilla versus Bambi.
A classic of filmmaking.
Indeed.
I think the first Godzilla film I ever saw.
Okay.
Hey everybody, Eric here with a word from our sponsor.
This episode is brought to you by WorkOS. If you're building a B2B SaaS app, at some point your customers will start asking for enterprise features like SAML authentication, SCIM provisioning, role-based access control, and audit trails. That's where WorkOS comes in, with easy-to-use and flexible APIs that help you ship enterprise features on day one without slowing down your core product development. Today, some of the hottest startups in the world are already powered by WorkOS, including ones you probably know, like Perplexity, Vercel, Jasper, and Webflow. WorkOS also provides a generous free tier of up to 1 million monthly active users for user management, making it the perfect authentication and authorization solution for growing companies. It comes standard with rich features like bot protection, MFA, roles and permissions, and more. If you are currently looking to build SSO for your first enterprise customer, you should consider using WorkOS. Integrate in minutes and start shipping enterprise plans today.
Anyway, one reason we haven't gotten to the other points of criticism is because you've spent an long time reiterating things I agree with.
All right. Good. All right. So then
I contend, Brad, let me speak a sentence here.
Yes.
It is my podcast too, nominally.
Yes.
And let me speak a sentence in my defense.
Yes.
I see zero upside to failing to warn about China Shock 2. Zero upside.
Touche.
So anyway.
Touche.
All right.
We're not doomed yet.
We're not doomed. We're definitely not doomed. But
unless financial capitalism overwhelms us.
Unless financial capitalism overwhelms us.
And if you're looking at recent news coming out of Intel about investor disgruntlement with Pat Gelsinger's attempts to actually focus primarily on Intel as stakeholder network and technology forcer, rather than as source of money for shareholders. You have to kind of worry that perhaps financial capitalism has too great a chance of winning this.
It will be very difficult.
Okay. So let's move on. The second thing I wanted to criticize you was that you've gotten into the very popular and to a great degree justified beating up on the priesthood to which we both belong, the sect, the narrow and dogmatic sect of the priests of Adam Smith. And you say you see economics and economists in decline, and I by contrast see bad economists in decline. At least in Berkeley, which is not representative, I very much see good economists on the rise. And
Brad, which post of mine are you talking
optimistic about economists and economics than I've been in quite a while.
Where did I say this?
Where did you say this?
I didn't see an economics in decline post in the notes.
Okay.
Because I actually think the economics profession as an academic research field is improving, even as economics has suffered a decrement in its influence in the halls of politics that I predict will be long-lasting but ultimately transitory.
Long-lasting but ultimately transitory. Why?
Oh, because I think that the Great Recession, we are still living in the post-2008 world in terms of economists' institutional influence, and that there was basically economists took a gigantic hit to their political influence after 2008 that is now very slowly starting to be rebuilt, but it will take a long time. And I think there are some structural factors within the profession, the division between macro and micro, the rise of new empiricism and things like that are making the economics profession both better in terms of better able to give advice and also less able to give the kind of flashy bad advice that makes economists seem like all-purpose sages.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I think
it is
what happened
twilight of the economists. The West's former top intellectuals grope for relevance in a fast-changing world. You kind of dump on Stephen Moore. You dump on Peter Navarro. I'm not sure whether you're dumping on the very sharp Ernie Tedeschi or not. But at any event, think that Jared's choice of Ernie as chief economist for the CEA is a sign at least about lowering prestige among academic economists, at least. Oh, yes, this is not a knock on Ernie.
No, Ernie is good. Ernie is good, but
Ernie is good.
But the fact that
Angus
you couldn't find a more teched up version of Ernie in academia is a knock on macro academia.
Yes. Okay.
Ernie's a good guy, but he was never going to be working as a professor. Because he's too pragmatic to work as a professor, which is because professors of macroeconomics can't be pragmatic and still have a job.
If I were at my office, I would now look slightly to my right at at kind of Emmy Nakamura and Jan Steinson's offices. And I would say they're firmly as pragmatic as Ernie Tedeschi when they want to be. And could certainly have done the chief economist's job, as well as Ernie. They're extremely persuasive, extremely sharp, extremely teched up, and extremely pragmatic.
You're right. However, they are much more needed in the reform macroeconomic theory fight than they are in the convince the government to change interest rates a little bit.
There are an awful lot of people who could be a good chief economist for the CEA. There are very few Clark medalists and so forth, and very few potential intellectual leaders to make macroeconomics actually relevant and useful.
So I think what my position is that 80% of economists work on micro,
mm-hmm.
micro has gotten a lot better, and micro's influence was started from a very low base and is now increasing from a very low base due to the improved methods of microeconomists.
Mm-hmm. To which I would point out that Matthew Iglesias disagrees with you, that he sees a collapse of the influence of cost benefit analysis and of economists type of agenda setting for priorities, at least among the Democratic Party infrastructure in the United States today.
I cannot actually speak to that. I do not know if that is happening or not. But I do think that most of the advice that national politicians get from economists is macro related. Yes, they get some tax design input. I don't think that's changed. I think that you still call up Alan Auerbach to help you design a tax.
Yes.
And then you don't listen to him because the congressional bargaining process is just as fucked up as it always was, but you at least give Alan Auerbach a call.
You listen to him somewhat.
Yes. So I think that that hasn't changed, but most of what the government asks for input on is macro related, is things like, interest rates and spending and trade and exchange rates and blah, 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 banking, finance, financial collapse. And I think that here you have seen a big decrement in economist influence, where although I'd say the Biden administration listens to academic economists more than Trump did, but less than Obama and Clinton
more than Trump did. To kind of disarm yourself by blowing up the Trans-Pacific Partnership and then launch a trade war with China after blowing up all of your alliance weapons to do so is a quite remarkably stupid thing from an economics and a political economy perspective as well.
Well, I will not argue, but because I'm a big TPP supporter. But I will say that in terms of so now you have Janet Yellen, who is a great academic economist.
Yeah.
Right. You have Janet Yellen. Janet Yellen started out this administration as being for much more for engagement with China, economic, we need to work with China, blah, blah, blah. We need, and Janet Yellen has been tariff pilled and is now Janet Yellen is now going to Europe and trying to get them to do tariffs, to follow our tariffs.
Yeah.
That's how tariff pilled Janet Yellen has gotten. Well, and that doesn't mean Janet Yellen's not an influential person.
We both agree that with Adam Smith here, defense is more important than opulence.
Right.
And we also agree that, building technologically progressive communities of engineering practice is a very big and important thing that doesn't make it into the normal Ricardian comparative statics world. And so I think it's a combination of, it's not so much that she's gotten tariff pilled, rather it's that, increasing focus on technological development externalities on the one hand, and Xi Jinping's no limits partnership with the Tsar of Muscovy on the other, has made us think we really have no choice, but to no longer greatly welcome increased Chinese, American, European economic interdependence, but rather to properly guard our security and our long-term technological interests with respect to this relationship. In a way that was definitely not urgent before.
Yes. Janet Yellen's current policy push is not even slightly wrong.
Right.
But it definitely shows, the only people yelling that this is a bad thing, even Republicans don't yell this is a bad thing. The only people yelling this is a bad thing are people yelling from within the halls of economics, academia, and think tanks, and also a very few people who are kind of like pro-China, but nobody listens to them, the Quincy Institute, whatever. But economists are tweeting, tweets that get a whole 5 retweets saying, oh my God, this protectionism, why are we doing this? And no one is listening to them. So if you want to say like that that it's bad economists because the economics profession allowed itself to basically fall into a consensus that was deeply unhelpful in certain cases, which is the truth. If you want to say that's bad economists, that economists are bad economists in general, then I can't argue with that. Like, I agree. But I think that the idea that that economists dogmatic consensus in favor of, what we used to call free trade, for many years, the Greg Mankiw consensus. And Greg Mankiw is a smart guy and not a bad guy and not even an unusual guy in this respect.
Oh, Greg Mankiw was also a guy who claimed that the Trump 2018 tax cut would boost America's steady state capital stock by 20%, at the very same time that the right-wing but honest Tax Foundation was saying this is a combination of absolutely screwed up incentives that will do absolutely nothing but encourage shareholder buybacks, with money repatriated out from under the notional, the notional foreign capital accumulations box.
Right. So let's talk about Owen Zadar's
Greg is
paper.
a little bit too eager to be a little bit too pleasing to Republican politicians with technocratically bad policies. Yeah, with some contrast to his teacher and my teacher, Marty Feldstein, who was at least occasionally very, very brave.
Do you know the paper Tax Policy and Investment in a Global Economy by Gabriel Chadraw-Reich, Matthew Smith, Owen M. Zadar, and Eric Zwick?
Indeed, I do. Indeed, I do.
Well, I thought this was interesting.
Yes.
Because this finds that the Trump tax cut boosted domestic capital by 7%.
By a small amount, yes.
By 7%. And 7% is not 20%, but it is also not 0%. Mm-hmm. So, anyway, that's an interesting, middle ground. Early returns made it look like it was going to be 0%, but it just took a while to have an effect. And 7% is not nothing.
It is not nothing. It would be hard to design something that it was nothing. That was nothing.
The progressive Robert Reich wisdom that, the perpetual unchanging fixed belief that everything that happens in our economy is increasing inequality is wrong, because in the past, few years, in fact, since 2014 or so, we've seen wages at the bottom rise faster than wages at the top.
Yep.
And that was, and the Trump tax cuts don't seem to have done anything to stop that, although some aspects of it will increase
flows, and there are also income flows that make it into GDP, and there also are asset price changes as well.
Right, but it is not to
Emmanuel and Thomas try to track the asset flow, the asset price accumulations, but don't do that great a job.
Sure, the idea that
right.
Sorry.
So it seems that we are in general agreement that bad economists are, by and large, in retreat, in macro and in micro too. And you view this as economists as a whole moving away from indefensible, rigid, dogmatic orthodoxy. And I view it as people responding to actually learning more about the world. And to some people who were indeed ideologically attached to right-wing causes having much less impact and influence, on the world today than they would have had in previous times.
Right.
Yeah. So now, the third thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Thing.
The third thing I wanted to criticize you about is you have a strange enthusiasm for missile defense as something that you think is actually possible.
Yeah.
Yes. Missiles.
And I will give you an example.
Usually have to fire more than one missile in order to defend against an incoming warhead. And missiles need to be smarter, than the warheads that are heading for that. Or at least you can make warheads relatively cheaply, and you can also attach them to drones flying on the nape of the earth. In fact, you can attach warheads to trucks or to yachts or to all kinds of things. And so while missile defense certainly has its role in dealing with people who don't have a great deal of choice of weapons, who don't have a huge number of weapons, and who don't think very flexibly, right? say, people who want to deliver nuclear warheads elsewhere by launching giant ICBMs from North Dakota to fly in fairly predictable tracks around the world. That's not the way that smart people who really want to blow things up will blow things up in the future. And that we need to get much more used to the idea that basically we are what we have been since the coming of the Civil War. We are in huge trouble, where all of us are wandering around as eggshells armed with hammers with an increasing degree as time passes. And it is a miracle not many, many more things are blown up than in fact are.
Well, I have a couple responses to this.
Okay.
First is missile defense has saved untold numbers of lives in Ukraine,
Yes.
in the city of Kyiv,
Yes.
in the city of Odessa, in the
Yes.
city of Zaporizhia, in the
Yes.
city of Kharkiv, and in these.
Kharkiv has a harder time, but yes. Yeah.
Kharkiv has a harder time because they can hit it with artillery.
Yes.
But the missiles that Russia has launched at Ukrainian civilians,
Yes.
many of these missiles have been stopped and many Ukrainians are alive.
Yes.
Was it expensive? Yes. Was it, am I prepared to say that it was that those lives that were saved were not worth the dollar price? No. But I will say that Russia is not a mediocre, mid-level, low-level opponent. Russia is a powerful opponent, the second most powerful opponent we're ever going to face, and the second most technologically advanced opponent that we're ever going to face.
Which is the question of just what the hell is the Russian military think that it is doing? Yeah.
Well, I don't know, but the point is that
it is not mobilizing itself on a World War II scale and waging a total war to conquer Ukraine in a national war, in an essential national war of survival, which is what Putin keeps on saying, that it is doing.
But they're mobilizing quite a lot, and they've switched a lot of their economy toward military production. Like this is the biggest war mobilization that we've seen in a long time. And
but
of course,
it's only like 20% of GDP.
But Russia can't build a lot of those new missiles, even if it mobilizes, because
as
it doesn't
opposed
have technological
to
capacity.
As opposed to 60%, of GDP for the military.
I understand, but my point is that Russia can't make a lot of those missiles. China
It's to buy them from Iran. It's to buy them from Iran, which is quite remarkable.
No, it's buying drones from Iran. It's not buying missiles from Iran.
No, who's it buying? Who are it's getting the missiles from?
It makes its own missiles very, very slowly.
So it's buying missiles from North Korea, which makes them somewhat faster?
No, it doesn't buy. It's buying ammunition from those places. It's buying missiles from itself. Russia's making its missiles.
Okay.
The Kinjal missiles made in Russia. These missiles. The S-400s are made in Russia. No other country makes those.
But are they ramping up missile production rapidly? Are they building?
They're trying, but they're majorly constrained by a number of things. One is parts for the factories come from Germany. And those are still possible to get, but a lot harder to get. Another is the skilled labor has been sent to the front lines, because remember that when Russia mobilized its entire society for World War II, it was able to waste an entire generation and not even see that big of a population decline.
Yes.
Whereas Russia now, with low fertility rates, Russia has a fertility rate of 1.5, I think. It can't do that. It doesn't have those young people.
The difference between a fertility rate of 4.5 and a fertility rate of 1.5 is absolutely enormous. You could put the women and the old men in the factories.
Indeed.
And send the young men to the front and have most of them die.
Right. Yeah. But the young men, so in those days, the work required to make a weapon was much less technologically sophisticated, and that's still true in terms of artillery. Russia is putting old people and young kids in the artillery factories, and they're making plenty of artillery shells, which, just like they did in World War II. However, to make a missile, you need specialists. You need technical specialists that you did not even need to make most munitions in World War II. The game has changed. The thing that missile defense is defending against requires specialists to create. And a lot of those, 1 million people fled Russia, and those were all the nerds and the liberals and the young people. 1 million people fled
or it requires factories with robots.
But who builds the robots? China? I mean, in the long run, perhaps. But the point is that
I'm told that our latest ammunition factory in Texas was actually a turnkey construction by Turks.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
That was. Glory to the Turks. But anyway,
All right. Okay. We forgive you somewhat for your attempts to install neo-fisherism as orthodoxy in economic policy. Yes, thank you, Turkey, for helping us get an ammunition factory together.
Yeah. But here's the thing. So missile defense can work. It doesn't mean it always is the thing you want to use in any situation. It doesn't mean missile defense is not a panacea, but it's very effective in certain situations. And
it's
so
very effective in certain situations where they actually want to cause significant civilian pain, but they don't want to use their nuclear weapons. And what they have is they have a bunch of missiles and they don't really know what else they're going to do with it.
Right. I want to talk
very
about
much the position of Muscovy, is very much the position of the Houthis, is very much the position of Hamas, and very much the position of Hezbollah, is the position of Syria in some cases, and maybe the position of Iran and North Korea.
Right. So
that is most of the non-Chinese potential adversaries the United States and its friends are likely to face.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. I think missile defense against China will not be effective.
Mm-hmm.
It will be effective at a few things. Maybe you could like defend one position for like a little while, long enough to do. It won't be as big a deal. But but I will also say there's one other thing I have to say about missile defense, which is that in terms of nukes being able to overwhelm missile defense, they absolutely will. But nukes are really expensive. Really expensive to make. A nuclear ballistic missile with the warhead, and also really expensive to maintain. The cost benefit in terms of blocking nuclear weapons, I think, could be very high. But I don't think we yet have the technology to block things that fast. We can now block intermediate range ballistic missiles. We cannot block intercontinental ballistic missiles. They're still too fast. But someday we will get there, perhaps with the Brilliant Pebbles initiative. And we never thought
they heard Brilliant Pebbles 40 years ago was when I first heard of it. Yes. Agreed. It will come
first
someday.
Hear of electric cars, Brad, and now they're taking over the world.
Yes. Okay.
Well, okay, but the point is that if you can have them, if you can defend against nuclear weapons, you do that, even though you also view MAD as still in place. The idea of, and hear me out. Let me finish just a couple sentences here, okay? Hear me out.
Yeah.
The idea that we'd be able to use missile defense to give ourselves an invincible shield such that we don't have to worry about mutually assured destruction is wrong. Yes. And at the same time, it is incredibly imperative and important that we build as much missile defense against nuclear weapons as we can, even though it will never cancel out mutually assured destruction, because it will create harm reduction.
Degrade the benefit costs of actually using the nukes, which is all
that too, but
which is already clearly fraught because no one has used them yet.
Yes. And so let me finish a couple more sentences here.
Yes.
So if Russia launches nukes and they blow up half the American population, America has been destroyed. That is destruction. However, if in that Holocaust, missile defense could save 180 million Americans or whatever, 160 million Americans, even though the United States as a nation will be done, and those people will all probably get cancer at age 55, and they will be wandering around in a post-apocalyptic wasteland for several years. If you save hundreds of millions of people, that is worth doing. It shouldn't cancel out MAD. You shouldn't view it as a substitute for MAD. You shouldn't view it, but you should still do it.
Yes.
And so that's really important. It's
now,
the difference between nuclear weapons destroying the current existing political structure of nation states and nuclear weapons destroying human civilization in total is big.
Large. Yes.
So there you go.
Which means we also should do a podcast someday on the shape of war in the 21st century.
We should do that podcast.
Because I had thought I understood the shape of war. I had thought I'd understood the shape of war was either guerrilla wars shading into terrorism on the one hand, and that anything bigger than that was, with rare exceptions like Iraq, 1991, and like Iran versus Iraq in the 1980s, were kind of ruled out by a combination of mutual assured destruction and the fact that when you went to war, you mobilized your entire economy. And there was nothing that you could gain from a war that was worth the kind of total industrial mobilization that everyone underwent during World War II. And now, at least, the conflict in Ukraine, the conflict in Syria, which is something more than guerrilla war shading into terrorism, suggests that you have these things that are clearly not nuclear, where the nuclear line is not going to be crossed by anyone. But it's also not a major, we mobilize the entire economy because we actually want to win this thing. You know, it's that we mobilize some of our economy because winning this thing is kind of an issue, but at the margin, raising the share of our national product we devote to the war mobilization from 20 to 60% is not worth it for some reason or other. In the Ukraine case, it's not worth it because the extra 40% mobilization won't actually do very much, because the things that matter for Ukraine are how much aid NATO gives it, plus the initial 20% high value mobilization tranche of the GDP that they've put into the war efforts so far. And in Russia, it's that they've put in 20%, and the value for the military value of the extra 40% is very, very low, or perhaps zero. And the thing burbles on. Thing burbles on with anyone who can be seen getting killed.
Brad, I half agree with you, because I do think that the percent of Ukraine's GDP it's devoting to the war is World War II level.
There's still a huge number of people who are not mobilized, right?
Not mobilized for soldiers, but they're supporting the domestic economy.
They're supporting, that Ukraine is spending more than 100% of its GDP on the war. And yet
Ukraine is spending more than 100% of its GDP on the war.
And Ukrainians are not starving. But that's because there's a bunch of things coming in from outside, right? Both directly in war material and indirectly elsewhere to kind of keep. And the Ukrainian civilian standard of living has not fallen that much.
Right.
That it's nothing
the
like
idea is
the Russian or even the British standard of living during World War II.
Right. Russia is pioneering a new kind of imperialism.
Yes.
That I call slow imperialism, where what you do is you partially mobilize your society and then go to continuous mid-level warfare, where you mobilize to the largest sustainable degree.
Yes.
And you continue to press onward in the hopes that your opponents will either get tired and give up, or be unwilling to, escalate, or both.
Meantime, there's a war on, so you have no possibility of any political opposition to you rising up at all.
Right. And as long as they,
I've read about this. I've read about this in a book. I've read about this kind of configuration of society in a book that was written in the year 1948. Haven't we?
Yes, we have.
That this was the logic of Ingsoc. This was the logic of Oceania and also of Eurasia and East Asia. This was the logic of O'Brien and the Inner Party.
Okay, yes,
so
it's true.
How come no one says, how come I don't see this said every week, that Russia, Putin's Muscovy is 1984 brought to 2024?
Well, because people have forgotten most of the things about that book.
Ah, okay. So the point is that the book is a meme trope rather than an actual book.
No, I would say that all books are that, because most people, any influential book, most people haven't actually read it, even most of the people who say they've read it.
Pride and Prejudice?
I haven't read it.
Pride and Prejudice may be an exception, but that you haven't read it is a bad point. Bad is bad for me.
Yes.
Right.
We read other Bronte books.
Yes.
But that's Bronte,
not
right?
a Bronte book. It's an Austen book.
Oh, it's an Austen book.
Alas.
Yeah. Well, we didn't read any.
On the other hand, confusing the Brontes, the Radcliffes, and the Austens is, I think, wholly forgivable. Only if you thought it was a Walter Scott book would I be ragging on you right now.
I'm just not too worried about not having read that kind of literature because I just don't get that much out of it.
Okay.
The Victorian era British.
Yes. All right. Well, now we are at an hour.
We're at an hour.
The other thing I wanted to push you on was on whether democracy is in decline, or rather what kind of democracy is in decline, or rather what kind is democracy. But I think that's a big enough can of worms. We should save it for next time.
All right. We'll save it for next time.
Okay. So then, what, Noah, is your key insight?
Well, my key insight is that you have when people predict things and endorse things, nuance is important.
Mhm.
And it is not necessarily incumbent on the reader to provide nuance to themselves, because the reader provides nuance to only one person, while the writer provides nuance to a large number of people.
Mhm.
And therefore, if my writings saying that missile defense was, useful, much more useful than the critics thought, that economist influence had, in the halls of power had declined since 2008, and that the first China shock really happened, and that the second China shock is something worth worrying about. If I wrote those in such an unnuanced way that some people took away the messages of missile defense will make nuclear war obsolete, economists are full of shit, and then the China shock 2 is inevitable, then it is my mistake, not their mistake, and then I must be more clear about what I'm saying.
All right. So your key insight is that at least sometimes Noah needs nuance.
Definitely. Very difficult to do in a world where a lot of people just read the titles of posts.
Yeah,
you did not, though. You read the whole post and you knew all the background to this.
I would say that Noah needs nuance, but I also would say that nuance is nearly impossible to attain or maintain, in these days. The only real way to get nuance is to write a whole book and then have people deeply engage with it, which requires that they be on a transoceanic flight with dodgy Wi-Fi and be otherwise bored.
Indeed.
And so this is...
So your key insight is that the internet makes us dumb by distracting us.
Well, the internet makes us less nuanced than we should be.
Yes. All right. That's a good key insight. But we have one more key insight as usual, which is...
Hexapedia.
Indeed.
Key insight.
This has been Noah Smith and Brad DeLong's Hexapedia podcast. Thank you very much for listening.
And goodbye.
And goodbye.
Econ 102 is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen, In the Arena, The Cognitive Revolution, and more. If you like what you hear, subscribe and leave us a review in the App Store. You can keep up with both of our Substacks for written analysis of the topics we cover in the show at noahopinion.substack.com and erictornberg.substack.com. Thanks for listening.